Hello everyone and welcome. My name is Dr. Richard Mendelson and I'm an industrial and organizational psychologist. Today I'm here to speak with you about contemporary developments in psychology. As a person who's worked in the field of psychology for well over a decade and studied in the field of psychology for a decade prior to that, I have a pretty good idea of the challenges, the unique situations that are arising, and the difficulties that many people in the field of psychology face at different stages of their development, meaning from the time they're a student all the way up through the time they're a working professional. In addition to being an industrial and organizational psychologist, I'm also a bit of a historian in the field of psychology. I have pretty good general knowledge in terms of different fields of study within the specialization of psychology, major contributors in different fields, different theoretical constructs and frameworks, and it's in that regard that I'm here today. I want to be able to share with you some of the information that I have about contemporary developments in the field of psychology. Thank you for spending time with me. Development and progress. Before we get into why we're facing challenges and what specific challenges we happen to be facing, I want to discuss briefly why our field continues to develop. Now, what I mean by that is if you had picked a different field of study, for example, if you had decided to study in the STEM field, science, technology, engineering, or mathematics, a lot of people consider those to be what they call the, quote, hard sciences. They tend to view what we do as social scientists as contributing to the body of knowledge in what they call the soft sciences. Now, the hard sciences, they're known as hard sciences not really because they're more challenging or more difficult, but really they're known as the hard sciences because the information that is postulated and tested is demonstrated to be concrete factual information. For example, we've discussed in a prior video the concept of 2 plus 2 equaling 4. It doesn't matter what culture you speak with, it doesn't matter where on this earth you go, it is a constant. 2 plus 2 will always equal 4. Even when, as I stated in our previous video, even when people don't have necessarily the ability to explain why 2 plus 2 equals 4. 2 plus 2 is a constant. It's always going to equal 4. Now, in our field, as people change, as society changes, as we experience cultural growth, personal growth, growth of humankind in general, as we continue to move forward historically, we're going to continue to experience challenges and conflicts. Now, challenges and conflicts are oftentimes viewed as being a very negative thing. But I want to make sure that I'm clear when I explain that without conflict and without challenge, growth will no longer occur. And if growth doesn't occur, then the field will become stagnant. Okay? And when a field stagnates, people begin to stray away. They don't focus on it anymore. We have some specializations in psychology that have gone that route. For example, there was a field of study called phrenology. Phrenology was the belief that by feeling the shape and lumps and divots in a person's skull, you could somehow tell that person about their personality, about their life experiences, and things like that. Obviously, over time, that was debunked and proven to be what some may call or may consider to be like a junk science. So our field continues to push forward, and in different times in human history, it may be pushing forward at what we would consider to be breakneck speed. Other times, it may move a little bit more conservatively, a little bit more slowly. But really, it results from the conflict and challenges that are experienced by what we call concerned stakeholders. For social sciences, concerned stakeholders really should include all of humankind, all of humanity, regardless of culture, regardless of geographical locale, regardless of religious faith or any other type of defining characteristic. Every human being should be concerned with the growth and development and the progress made in all social sciences, but in particular the field of psychology. The field of psychology moves forward, and it is unique among other social sciences because, regardless of what field of study you choose to pursue, psychology as a whole is considered to be the field that sets the bar in terms of the quality and the expectations for social science research. Research continues to drive us forward, not necessarily because we're interested in finding answers, although answers are nice, but we've discussed in a prior video that if you develop answers, then there's nothing left to study. So what research does is it continues to drive us forward towards more refined and better research questions for future researchers to pursue. Now, in doing that, in developing and generating better questions for people to pursue answers to, every generation that presents itself in our field, well, part of the responsibility of each generation is to produce high quality and high caliber research leading towards those better research questions and those more defined research questions for those who come after. There's a saying in social science and psychology in particular, we stand on the shoulders of giants. Now what that means is we can do very good work right now, we could do exceptional research right now, but without those who came before us, without those who began this field of study, without those who built the foundation for the house that we live in and work in and operate in right now, we wouldn't be anywhere in this field. So those who came before us, we continue to pay homage to them by recognizing that without their work, we wouldn't be doing what we're doing today. That's a main reason why it's so important that when we write papers or journal articles or anything of that nature, that we cite and reference those who came before us properly to credit them for the work that they did, for the thoughts that they generated, and for the ideas that they presented that allowed us to move forward in our field of study or chosen field of endeavor. Today there are 4 topics that I'm going to be discussing with you. We are dealing with what's called a replication crisis in social sciences and other fields of research, frankly. We're going to discuss diversity in psychology. We're going to discuss the overlap of technology and psychology. And we will spend a few minutes talking about the fastest growing fields in psychology. Now, before we get going, I want to address an issue. I know that we have students from many different countries. We have students who currently reside in many different countries around the world because of the fact that Kaiser University is not only a traditional brick and mortar institution, but we also have distance and remote learning opportunities where students are able to engage in our courses from anywhere in the world. The reason I bring this up is that I want to make it clear the information that I'm presenting today is presented from what's called a Eurocentric or America-centric perspective, meaning that because we happen to be based in the United States of America, as well as the fact that the American Psychological Association is known globally as really the premier organization that governs the science of psychology, I'm presenting the information to you today from the perspective of those who would live, work, and operate within the system designed by the American Psychological Association. That's not to say that this information is not consistent or not valid or reliable wherever other people may happen to be, but I want to make it clear that this is the perspective that this information will be presented from. What is the replication crisis? So we have a situation in social science where a study that is done today that generates results, it may be considered seminal in the field, meaning of paramount importance. It may be one of the field-changing studies, the major research studies that influence the way people who come after you perform research and view topics in the field of psychology. The problem is there was a study done some time ago that looked at the reproducibility of research. Meaning, let's take a major study. For example, Pavlov's dogs. We've discussed them in a prior research study. So let's say, for example, that today we were to reconduct the study with Pavlov's dogs to see if they can be conditioned to salivate at the sound of the bell. Well, Pavlov demonstrated that he could condition dogs to salivate at the sound of a bell. But what would happen if we did the same study today and we weren't able to reproduce the same results? What would that teach us about conditioned learning? What would that teach us about conditioned behaviors? Well, we would have a problem. The reason why is because behaviorism as a field of study was heavily influenced by Pavlov's work. So if we were to try and reproduce Pavlov's study today and it did not generate similar results, how do we know that all the work that has been built based on Pavlov's theories is valid, reliable, and accurate? How do we know that it's correct? And see, that's the challenge. Because when it comes to social science, most people are not conducting research using dogs or rats or other animals. Most people are conducting research using human beings. Now, human beings, over time, they change. The attitudes, the opinions, the beliefs, and even the behavior of human beings now is vastly different to the attitudes, opinions, and behavior of human beings even 20 years ago. So, for example, let me put this in perspective. This is an iPhone. It's an Apple iPhone. These did not become available for public possession and consumption until approximately 2007. It's now 2020. 13 years ago, people did not have smartphones. It seems like, for the most part, people have had them forever because there's so much a part of our everyday life experience now. We shop on our phones. We talk to one another on our phones, but we video chat face-to-face on our phones. We take pictures and have cameras on our phones. We have social networks. For the most part, prior to the invention of the iPhone, most of this stuff seemed like futuristic craziness, things that we would never believe that we could actually have and engage with and work through on a daily basis. And yet, nowadays, it's our everyday practice that we don't think twice about. People change. Our behaviors have changed. The way we influence one another has changed. So any study done some time ago or on a slightly different population or sample may not yield the same results if it is performed again. And that's why I have the picture just below me of the falling house of cards. Imagine that the paramount research, the pivotal, seminal papers that we read in this field, they are the first layer in that house of cards that you see before you. Now, as time passes, every single generation, every single group produces more and more research that leads to the second, third, fourth, and even fifth and sixth stories on that house of cards. So imagine having a house of cards that's built and it's 4 or 5 stories high. And that represents 4 or 5 generations of people in the field of social science or in psychology in particular. And all of a sudden we find out one of those foundational studies, one of those cards at the bottom of the house of cards on the first level can't be reproduced, so we no longer know if it's reliable and valid in terms of its results. What happens when you try and take that card, that single card out from the bottom level of a house of cards? Well, when you look below, you'll see exactly what happens. The whole house of cards will collapse. It will fall. That's why we have what we call the replication crisis. That's a problem in social science. It's important because we now have to question everything that prior to now was accepted as correct or factual. So where do we go from here? Well, we have to take this as an opportunity to recognize that perhaps we need to reassess the methods by which we're conducting research. We need to look at how other fields are also faring in terms of whether they're facing the same replication crisis. We also have to accept that research, by its very nature, as I've stated several times throughout the videos I've recorded, research does not lead to answers. It leads to better and more refined questions. With that in mind, perhaps the replication crisis is simply part of the natural evolution of research. As time passes, as human beings change, it makes sense that the results and outcomes from research conducted on human beings would also change. So here's the statistics on the replication crisis. In August 2015, a group called the Open Science Collaboration performed a study. They selected 100 social science research studies, and they replicated every single one of them. What they found, out of the 100 studies that they replicated, 97% yielded significant results in the original study, meaning of the 100 studies they did, 97% were written, published in peer-reviewed scholarly journals saying that there were significant results. But when those 100 studies were replicated, only 36 out of the 100 studies yielded significant results. 36% versus 97%. Just think about that for a moment. When these studies were conducted, 97% yielded significant results. When the same exact studies, with the same exact protocols, with the same exact methods, with the same exact everything except sample, when those studies were reconducted, only 36% yielded significant results. Other fields also have this challenge. In medicine, they have tremendous challenges with the replication crisis, in particular when looking at clinical trials, when looking at the studies that are performed on new and evolving surgical procedures. Oftentimes, these types of studies are performed and you have very low levels of significance if you try and recreate those same studies. Political science. Political opinions change dramatically over time. Globally right now, we seem to be involved in somewhat of a political upheaval. And as a result of that, political science research that was completed even 10 years ago is likely to yield completely different results than the research that's being conducted right now anywhere in the world. Environmental science. Imagine this. We have people who are conducting research and are helping to create policy about things like medicine, global warming. Think about right now. You have people who are studying environmental factors that contribute to the spread of, say, COVID-19 or other different diseases or viruses that we are trying to deal with as a human population. And based on the research that's conducted, we have people creating policy. And that policy is implemented. Now, what if the research that's behind those policies is flawed? Well, then we're really going down the wrong path in terms of what we're trying to do and the things we're trying to enact to correct those challenges. So the replication crisis is not only a problem because we're not able to recreate the exact results that we found, but it's a problem because of the implications of that. We make recommendations and decisions regarding what to do and how to help people based on the outcomes of research. When you hear people on television that create policy, politicians, lawmakers, you'll often hear them say, "We go where the science tells us to go. We follow the research. The data doesn't lie." But due to the replication crisis, we have to ask ourselves the question, what if the data isn't telling us the truth for all time? What if the truth today is different from the truth tomorrow? If we respond to the truth today and we try and correct the challenges based on what we think we know or what we believe that we have as truth, if we try and act upon that information right now, what if that information is not accurate or it's not truth tomorrow? What do? How do we address that problem? The truth of the matter is, there's not a great answer yet. There's not. And that's problematic, especially in psychology, because the information that we get from research, it informs our practices and how we treat people that have disorders, diseases, medical conditions, all different kinds of challenges that impact their behavior, their mental health. And if the information that we are basing our practice on is flawed or is no longer accurate or cogent, then we need to adapt our policies and practices. But we're not going to know it unless we try and reproduce all of those studies that led us down the path to where we are today. That's the replication crisis. Diversity in psychology is a rather large issue. Really across the board in just about all fields, a hot button topic these days is diversity. Now, most of the time when we discuss diversity, we do it from a perspective of what's happening culturally and what's happening, in workplaces. So, for example, is an organization working to hire people with diversity in mind? But we don't often pay enough attention to the issues that led us to have these diversity challenges today. Psychology was not immune to the issues that caused some of the diversity issues that we experience today. For many years, psychologists who were serving as faculty at institutions of higher education, they worked with policy in mind to address what they called the Jewish problem. Essentially, you had too many Jewish people who were considered qualified, who were applying for admission to the top institutions. During this period of time, let's say the 18 and 1900s, one of the challenges that was faced was anti-Semitic beliefs. People who had a dislike or essentially what amounts to like racist ideology against people who happened to be Jewish. So this was known as the Jewish problem. Essentially, people who were in higher education, who were in position to admit individuals to these institutions to matriculate or continue their studies, they were choosing consciously to only admit a very small number, if any, Jewish applicants to their universities. They were actively working to decrease the number of Jewish students. And this was particularly troublesome once students got past the undergraduate stage, meaning once they had earned a baccalaureate degree and were entering into graduate school programs. You may recall from some of the other presentations that psychology was very heavily influenced by people who were coming from Europe. Germany in particular had many very well-known psychologists. Germany, Austria. These are all areas that through the 1900s in particular, the late 1800s through the early 1900s, experienced tremendous anti-Semitic sentiment. When people were applying for graduate school positions, oftentimes those who were making decisions were coming from that background. They chose not to admit many Jewish students, and those who were admitted, they faced enormous amounts of anti-Semitic treatment and issues while they were part of the program that they were enrolled in. Upon graduation, there was virtually no chance that a person of Jewish ancestry was going to be hired as faculty to teach psychology at any of the institutions of higher education, which resulted in, from the early to mid-1900s, the majority of Jewish people who were graduating with advanced degrees in psychology, they entered into private practice and began treating patients as psychotherapists. What has happened is that over time, we've seen that there are an enormous number of psychotherapists of Jewish ancestry, some of them second and even third generation. Part of the reason why is that when there was not opportunity to work as faculty in the field, Jewish people struck out and said, okay, we're going to find a way to make a living doing what it is that we've been trained to do. And that was open up their own practice and become practicing psychotherapists. In addition to Jewish people, there were other groups who were also oppressed unfairly. African American students in particular, they were not admitted in America to predominantly white institutions at all until the late 1960s. And once the 1960s and the civil rights movement happened, they were able to gain admission to institutions of higher education, but to pursue graduate degrees and graduate studies was increasingly difficult. At this point in time, once they were admitted, or at that point in time, I should say, I apologize, in the 1960s and such, once they were admitted, they faced tremendous racism, and frankly, there were sometimes insurmountable barriers that were placed between them and program completion. It's important to know that a lot of these barriers were institutional. A lot of them were also individual-based, meaning that faculty and people who were there to help students actively campaigned against helping people who happened to be African American. Women were not given equal opportunity as well. In order to attend any federally funded university, it was very challenging as a woman to even gain admission until Title IX, which is a policy that was passed to ensure what we call gender equity. And this didn't happen until 1972. So the field of psychology is heavily influenced by academia, and academia is heavily influenced by psychology, because even to this day, people who are in positions of leadership at many of the top institutions across the world come from a social science and psychology background. The anti-Semitism, the racism against African Americans, and the oppression and really subversion to prevent women from rising to levels of high achievement in the field. Frankly, they're a blemish on the history of our field of study. The belief is that when you have a situation like this where there are some truly negative and frankly awful things that have been done previously, a lot of times people have a desire to kind of sweep it under the rug, as they say, or look at it as if, well, it's the past, it doesn't matter. But the reality is the past does matter. And if we forget the past, as they say, we are doomed to repeat it. So steps have been taken by people in the field of psychology to work towards diversity and to provide opportunity to people who are members of groups that were historically not given their due. Groups of people who are oppressed, people who are prevented from succeeding in the field, people who are not even given an opportunity to matriculate or study in our field. Which leads us to the present day. The Jewish problem. Well, as of 2016, Jewish people account for 39 out of the top 100 most eminent psychologists of the 20th century, meaning Jewish people have not only been given opportunity, but have also risen to a level where they are one of the predominantly successful groups in the field of psychology. African American students. As of 2015, it's evident we still have an enormous amount of work to do. 5.3% of psychologists in the American workforce were identified as Black or African American. While African American people represent roughly, I believe it's 16% of the population of the United States. So here in the United States of America, we have an enormous amount of opportunity, an enormous amount of work to be done to provide African American people with an option of pursuing degrees in social science fields like psychology, so that we can not only have a more diverse way of thinking in our field, but also because we have a population of people, and frankly, when they go to seek out help for mental health issues, it's very challenging to find a person who perhaps has shared cultural or life experiences. And as a result, treatment, it's not as comfortable an experience for people who are African American who are seeking mental health care, which is a huge problem. Women have actually been given a lot more opportunity. As of 2018, in psychology graduate programs, women outnumber men 3-1. For every one man enrolled in a psychology graduate program, there are 3 women enrolled in a graduate psychology program. Excuse me. Of all psychology PhDs who are entering the workforce, 76% of newly minted, meaning newly graduated doctoral PhD level students who are now graduates, doctors, 76% are women. And that accounts for any capacity in which they're working in the field. It could be serving as faculty. It could be working as psychotherapists. It could be working as school counselors, guidance counselors, educators, administrators, research scientists, anything that would be considered working within the field of psychology. Women outnumber men in terms of new hires at a rate of 3-1. Now, how do technology and psychology overlap? There's a lot of debate about this topic. Personally, I've had the opportunity to contribute to this field of study as a member of several panels at large conferences, and I've also had the opportunity to contribute to the literature base in the form of several articles. The issues that we face when we implement use of psychology into our everyday practice with artificial intelligence, artificial empathy, and other aspects of technology is that we have to ask the question, does the addition of technology remove the humanity from the psychology profession? Are we removing the human aspect, the social aspect of social science? And we also have to ask questions like, what type of applications within psychology should be allowed to use technology? Now, as an industrial and organizational psychologist working with workplace issues and human aspect of the workplace, I can tell you that many times we hear about companies that are promising, oh, we can completely automate your employee selection process. We're going to be able to use algorithms and bots and computer software and technology to do your entire interview process. And the applicant will never have any idea that they're talking with a computer. To them, it's going to be a real person. But you won't have to pay personnel hours to work through this. And we're going to use technology to be able to determine who the best candidates are for your position. It sounds like a wonderful thing. But we have to bear in mind that programming has been demonstrated to perpetuate the biases and prejudice of the people who write the code. We have an imbalance in the STEM fields, science, technology, engineering, and math, of which computer coding happens to be a part. Now, with this in mind, we have found that there are several programs that were being used for employee selection that were not giving what we call in America people of color, African Americans and other population minority groups were not being given the same opportunity, were oftentimes being disregarded by technology because of different technological issues that made it challenging to recognize and understand things like facial expression, tone of voice, and other different types of biometric measures that are used. So for example, right now, you're watching a video of me. My camera on my computer is recording my face, and it's, putting the image of my face and me sitting here in my home office against the Kaiser University logo and into this presentation. But what if the camera was used for, let's say, less ethical reasons? For example, if I'm doing a job interview and that camera is able to record or able to detect pupil dilation in my eyes, right? My eyes. If it's able to detect blood flow through the use of technology that measures heat, thermal camera imaging. What if it's able to detect level of perspiration or acidic content in my perspiration on my face? Well, then that camera can be used not only to do an interview, but it's also collecting what we call biometric data while I am doing the interview. And it's using that information to determine or generate data indicating whether I'm telling the truth, whether I'm trying to misrepresent myself, whether I am calm, whether I am dealing with a state of arousal or anxiety. And these are things that we don't consciously pick up on when we interview someone face to face. The challenge we have to face here is the ethical issue. When a person applies for a job, is it okay to look at biometric data? Is it okay to record them and examine blood flow and pulse rate and pupil dilation? These are things that people have not given permission for you to gather. However, oftentimes those are the very data points that are being used to determine who's the right fit for an organization or for a position. So we have to address the question of when and where should technology not be used, in addition to determining when should we be allowed to use it. Ethically speaking, at least at present, there are much stronger, more developed cases for statements about when technology should not be used in situations than there are for situations where technology should be used. And that leads us into the use of artificial intelligence and artificial empathy. Artificial intelligence at this point is a bit of a buzzword in psychology. We have people who are saying, oh, I have a true artificial intelligence program and I can use it to do these different things and to solve these different problems and to help screen people. And for example, if let's say there's a suicide prevention hotline, we can put everyone through this artificial intelligence screening process to try and determine who is in the most imminent danger of committing an irreversible act. And then we'll get those people to speak with operators right away. Well, the challenges are artificial intelligence tends to be, at this point in time anyway, highly algorithmic, meaning it's programmed to do certain things in response to certain answers and certain keywords. So, for example, an artificial intelligence may hear the word suicide and immediately you're elevated to a high level of risk. You need to speak with a physician or mental health professional right away and get help. But if you are presenting that artificial intelligence by reading a newspaper article instead of speaking with it, a human being would register that you're not engaged in that conversation with them. The artificial intelligence program is simply picking up on the word suicide and immediately connecting you with mental health. Now, that's probably a good thing in that situation. But if we were to implement this into our everyday life and artificial intelligence is used, there are going to be situations and scenarios in which people are going to be, frankly, improperly judged based on things that the artificial intelligence is algorithmically programmed to do. Artificial empathy is an entirely different thing. To this point, I happen to be an emotional intelligence researcher. There are companies out there saying that they can teach computers how to relate to human beings based on how we feel, how we experience things in our daily life, how we interact with one another, the quality of those interactions, and they can teach a computer how to respond adequately to us so that we are able to get help from computers and we're able to interact with machines on a level that we've never been able to interact with them before. At present, there frankly are not any groups out there that have done this effectively and been able to prove it empirically through any form of research. So now, let's talk about fastest growing fields in psychology. Each of you sitting there as a graduate student in the field of psychology, you probably have a bit of a plan in terms of what you want to do once you complete your program. So let's take a look at what fields in psychology are growing the fastest. School psychologists, the most opportunity out of any aspect of psychology is in school psychology. You get to assist with education testing. You get to work with students who are having challenges socially. You get to work with students who are having behavioral issues. And some school psychologists also engage in research to be able to not only promote themselves as scientists, but also to be able to help drive the field of study forward. The second fastest growing field is family counselor or therapist. Family counselors and therapists serve a tremendous purpose really anywhere you go in the world. With the stresses of everyday life, the challenges that people have based on trauma that they experience, and behavioral issues, family counselors and therapists are an invaluable part of our community. They are serving a purpose of helping people. In a sense, they are probably one of the purest forms of helping professions that exist. Most family counselors or therapists come from one of two backgrounds educationally. Some are what we would call like a licensed mental health counselor, meaning that they have done master's degree level studies. Typically it's in a clinical mental health or clinical mental health counseling field. Or people come from a clinical psychology background. Now the difference is that the clinical psychologists are typically trained at a higher level to treat people with true diagnosable disorders. Things like obsessive compulsive disorder, things like attention deficit and hyperactivity disorder, bipolar disorder, things like that. Typically, a clinical psychologist is more highly trained and specialized in addressing those types of issues. When it comes to things like dysthymia, which is kind of like, let's say it's like the equivalent of a common cold, but it's a mental health issue. Dysthymia, people dealing with stress, people dealing with, behavioral issues like, wanting to stop overeating or things like that. More often than not, they can get the care that they need from a clinical mental health professional. Forensic psychologists, they work with really criminals and prisoners. They want to identify trends and behavioral issues that contribute to what we would call deviant behavior. They also work within prisons and places like that to try and help rehabilitate convicted criminals. A lot of them also perform research to be able to help others who work in the field to more effectively treat